A note before this one begins. If you find your mind wandering after the second bend of this story, don't fight it. Sit with a warm cup, let the lamp burn low, and let the tale carry you the rest of the way. This story, along with the others I've been quietly gathering, will be released later this year as a small audiobook. A single long night of listening, read in this same voice, with none of the bright interruptions that break these stories on the open road of the internet. If you'd like to know when it's ready, the letters go out once a season. No more, no less, and the link sits waiting in the notes below this story. There are ridges in the Blue Ridge where the doors on the low side of the house are still latched before the sun goes down, and nobody in those hollows will tell you why. They just don't leave the low door open after dusk. You can drive up any of those old switchback roads today, past the mailboxes on their leaning posts, past the pale blue kitchen curtains people still hang for luck, and you'll find that the houses which face uphill keep one door open a hand's width until the last light leaves the ridge, and the houses which face downhill close the low door first, before the mother calls the children in, before the lamps are lit. Ask them. They will not tell you why. They'll say it's how their people did it. They'll say it's just the way. And if you press them, if you are a stranger and you press them, they will get a certain look. Not fear exactly, more like the look a man gets when you ask him about a debt he does not remember taking on. And they'll close the conversation with something soft and final, and then they'll wait for you to leave. Before this story goes any further, I want to know where you're listening from tonight. Type it in the comments. A town, a road, a mountain, a river. I read every one of them, and it always surprises me how far this voice carries. Sometimes I'll find that a story I told about a hollow in Kentucky was heard by a woman on a hillside in Wales, or a truck driver crossing the flatland of Kansas, or someone sitting by a window in a country I couldn't find on a map without help. Tell me where you are. That's how these old tales stay alive, by being carried. The story I want to tell you tonight was carried to me by a woman named Ellery Souter, who was born on Cutter's Ridge in the eastern part of what is now North Carolina, and who was in her middle 60s when she sat with me at a kitchen table in the winter of what she called the last year she trusted her memory. She was a small woman, gray-haired, with a good ear and a bad hip, and she poured coffee from a pot that had been her mother's, and she wore a red wool cardigan buttoned wrong at the second button, and she did not correct it while she spoke. The kitchen she sat in was a small one, with a wood stove that ticked in the corner even in warm weather, and a window over the sink that looked out on a chicken run and a bare pear tree, and a linoleum floor whose pattern had worn away along the 2 lines her feet had traveled between the stove and the table for 40 years. She kept a jar of buttons on the sill. She kept a folded newspaper under the pot. She kept, in a drawer she did not open in front of me, the small commonplace book her uncle had left her. She said, before she began, that she had never told the story straight through to anyone, and that she was telling it to me now because a woman who had been born on Cutter's Ridge in the year I was born on Cutter's Ridge did not get to take a story like this one with her into the ground. Those were her words. I am giving them to you the way she gave them to me. She told this story in careful pieces, the way you'd hand somebody a broken cup, a shard at a time, to keep them from cutting themselves. She said the story wasn't hers. She said it belonged to her uncle, a man named Verlin Ashmore, who was mid-40s the year it happened, tall for his family, narrow through the shoulder, with a black beard shot through at the chin with iron, hair pushed back from a broad forehead, and a bad left knee he'd carried since a mule kick in his 20s. Verlin farmed the south face of Cutter's Ridge, and he lived in a cabin his grandfather had built in the year 1866, and he was the kind of man his neighbors described in one word: careful. That is the word Ellery used. Careful. He walked into a room like a man reading a page. He never latched a door without checking the latch a second time. He never spoke first at a meeting. He was, in every way I can put in front of you, a man made for the rule, and the rule was made for men like him. Because there was a rule on Cutter's Ridge, and there is still, though nobody I asked would say it out loud. It went like this. If your cabin faced uphill, you latched the low door first, the one nearest the downslope, and you left the high door open a hand's width until the last color left the ridge. If your cabin faced downhill, same thing, but the mother of the house closed the low door before she called the children in, and no one, no grown man, no dog, no cat, no honored guest, was permitted to cross the threshold of a low door after the sun had gone. That was the rule. That was all of it. Nobody ever wrote it down. Nobody ever explained it. And every family on that ridge obeyed it the way a family obeys the sound of a distant train. automatically, without thought, the body knowing before the mind does. The year the trouble started was 1908. It was a wet spring, and then a dry summer, and then a long, warm autumn that hung on into what should have been the first hard week of frost. The corn came off the fields 3 weeks late. The hickory dropped its leaves in a single afternoon, all at once, the way a woman drops an apron when she is done with a day's work. The oak held. The walnut held. The apple trees along the lower cutbank kept their yellow into what would ordinarily have been the second frost. There is a kind of autumn on the Blue Ridge that old people warn each other about. A warm one, a slow one, a season that forgets to end, and 1908 was one of those. The old people on the ridge that year did not say the word for it. They only said, at the store, at the mill, on the porch of the meeting house, that the ground was staying open too long, and they said it in the tone of voice they used when they meant something more than what the words said. The ground staying open. The ground not closing for winter. That was the way they said it. Verlin heard it 3 times in the last week of September, from 3 different mouths, and each time he heard it he took a half step back in his own mind and made a small note, because a careful man keeps a small note when 3 different mouths shape the same worry in the same week. Verlin Ashmore was mid-40s then, and he lived alone that year because his wife, a woman named Sabra, 38 years old, dark-haired, small and thin-boned, with a chip in her front tooth from a fall as a child, had gone down to her sister's place in the flatland to nurse the sister through a hard birth. His wife had been gone 11 weeks. He wrote her every Sunday, in a slow hand, on paper he cut from the back of the ledger he kept for the smokehouse. Their marriage was a quiet, 26-year thing that had never produced a living child, and she was his ballast. When she was gone, he pinned one of her handkerchiefs to the inside of the cabin door, so that when he came home in the evenings, he could smell the small trace of her that was left in it. Cedar and yeast and the lavender water she pressed into the collars of her Sunday clothes. He said it kept the cabin from feeling like a place with no wife in it. He said the wall was the wall, but the handkerchief was hers. I want you to see the ridge the way he saw it. Cutter's Ridge is not a tall place. It's the sort of ridge that surprises you by how quickly the world becomes it. You drive 15 minutes off the main road and suddenly the sky is smaller and the trees are taller, and the light comes in horizontally and lays itself along the ground in strips. The road is unpaved, still, in places. Then and now. The switchbacks are cut by hand, in the old way, and the ditches beside them are lined with limestone the settlers pulled up out of the low fields. There is a certain smell to Cutter's Ridge in the autumn, wet leaf litter and cold iron from the spring house, and the faint sweet smoke of somebody's hickory a mile off, and under all of it a low sweet mineral note that the old people said was the ridge itself breathing out through the ground. And any Ashmore or Meese or Tackett or Crews you meet in the flatland today will tell you they can call up that smell in their memory in a single breath, though most of them have not been on the ridge in 50 years. Every cabin on Cutter's Ridge, and there were 9 of them then, was built with a low door and a high door, and every one of them faced with intention, so that no cabin faced west, and no cabin faced east, and no cabin looked directly at the shoulder of the mountain that rose behind them. You had to build sideways to Cutter's Ridge. That was how the elders had drawn the lines when the land was first surveyed in the years after the war. Sideways. Never at it. Never away. On the 4th day of that long, warm autumn, Verlin Ashmore came home from the field just as the sun was pulling itself along the ridge, and he did what he had done every dusk of his life. He latched the low door. He walked to the high door. He opened it a hand's width, and he went in and lit the lamp. He noticed nothing that first day. Neither did the dog. The dog was a black and tan hound named Prue, past 9, going gray around the muzzle, with one milky eye from an old briar cut. Prue slept under the kitchen table because that was the coolest board in the house in summer and the warmest in winter, and Prue had a habit of standing up before Verlin did, every morning in what Verlin called her sunrise stretch. She was, by all his accounts, a calm dog. She did not bark at wind. She did not fear thunder. She had once faced down a young black bear in the corn without so much as raising her hackles, and Verlin had counted that as the measure of her, ever since. On the 6th day, Prue would not go near the low door. She wouldn't cross the 4 feet of pine board that led to it. She would sit at the kitchen table with her tail flat, and her one good eye on the door, and when Verlin called her, she would only whine, low in her throat, a sound she had not made since her puppyhood. Verlin knelt down and put his hand on her chest, and he could feel the heart in her going faster than her body deserved. He didn't say anything to himself about it that day. He was a careful man, and careful men do not say the first thing they think. He simply walked to the low door himself in the last light, and he checked the latch, and it was latched, and the wood was sound, and the frame was set true. He stood there with his hand on the wood for a long time. That is when he first heard it. Not the dog. Not the wind. A very small sound, coming from the wrong side of the door. Wood settling. Wood settling on the outside. No, wait. Wood settling on the inside. On his side. But behind the door. Behind the wood he was touching. It stopped when he took his hand away. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment, because you understand that wood settles in a house. Every house on a ridge settles in the evening as the temperature drops. Every house has its own vocabulary of small ticks and pops and long, low complaints. Verlin Ashmore knew this house's vocabulary the way a man knows his own throat. And the sound he had just heard was not a word this house had ever spoken before. He stood back from the door. He looked at Prue. Prue looked at him. And he did what a careful man does. He turned around and he trimmed the lamp and he went to bed, because it was after dusk. And the rule was the rule. Latched low. Open high. And nobody crosses the low door after the sun has gone. On the 8th day, Prue was gone. He looked for her at first light. He walked the yard. He walked the smokehouse. He walked down to the spring, where she liked to lie in the wet grass in the summer months. He whistled her whistle, 3 short and a long, the whistle she had come to since her puppyhood, and there was nothing. The morning was quiet in a way that Verlin later said he had never heard a Cutter's Ridge morning quiet. There were no jays in the walnut. There were no crows. There was the sound of the spring, and there was the sound of his own boots in the dry leaves, and there was nothing else on the mountain. He came back to the cabin, and he stood at the low door, and he looked at it for a long time. The latch was still latched. The frame was still true. The dog was gone. He walked the ridge that day, house to house. There were 9 cabins on Cutter's Ridge in 1908, and he walked to every one of them. He talked to Cordell Meese, 54, tall and thick, red-faced, a farmer with a shaved head and a habit of chewing the inside of his cheek when he was thinking. He talked to Asaph Cruz, past 60, small and stooped, with a snow-white beard and a broken-veined nose and one hand that shook when he lifted his coffee. He talked to Mahala Tackett, past 70, thin as a reed, with silver hair pinned tight to her head and a black shawl she wore every day of the year and a habit of sliding her thumb along the stem of the pipe she never lit but always carried. He talked to a young couple named Jem and Iola Ballard. Jem was 28, thin and blonde, and Iola was 26, dark-haired, small, who had come to the ridge 3 years earlier from down in the flatland. He talked to a widow named Susie Yancey, past 60, heavy and slow, with a face like a folded quilt. He talked to a circuit preacher who was passing through. A man named Elder Wycliffe Barr, mid-50s, wiry, with white eyebrows and a black coat and the palest gray eyes Verlin had ever seen. He asked every one of them, at every one of those doors, whether they had heard anything the night before, whether they had seen the dog, whether they had noticed the morning being wrong. Every one of them had heard something. Nobody would say what. That was the thing that shook him. Not that they hadn't heard anything, that they had, and they wouldn't name it. Cordell Meese looked at the ground and said, "Verlin, you're a careful man. You keep on being one." Asaph Cruz closed his door partway when Verlin came onto the porch and said, "It's early yet. You come back in the daylight." Mahala Tackett listened to him from her rocker on the porch, with her thumb sliding up and down the stem of that unlit pipe, and when he finished she said, quiet and even, "Verlin, you latched the low door." "I did," he said. "Well then," she said, and she wouldn't say another word. He was on Elder Barr's porch just before noon, and the preacher, a man of the road, a man from off the ridge, was the only one who said what the others wouldn't. He said, "Something took your dog, Verlin, and it took her from the wrong side of a latched door. And I don't want you sleeping alone in that cabin another night." He said it with the flat, unemphasized certainty of a man reading scripture. He said it, and then he looked past Verlin, off toward the shoulder of the mountain, and he did not look at Verlin again until Verlin had turned to leave. Let's go back to the story. Have you ever known in your body that something was wrong, before your mind had the language for it? Have you ever stood at a door in your own house and felt in your chest that the person on the other side was not the person who ought to be there? If you have, I want you to tell me about it in the comments. Not for me, for the person listening tonight from a house they thought they trusted, who needs to know they aren't alone in that feeling. Every one of these stories I tell you was a story somebody sent me or told me or trusted me with because their own grandmother trusted them with it. So if you've got one, if the place you grew up had a rule nobody ever explained to you, leave it below. It might just become the next story I tell. Now, back to Verlin. He went home in the afternoon. He fed the chickens. He drew water. He walked the low side of the yard in the light, and he looked at the ground the way a careful man looks at the ground, and what he saw did not comfort him. There were tracks, Prue's tracks, coming out from under the low door, which was not possible because the low door was latched, and the gap under the low door was less than the height of a good man's little finger. There were tracks coming out. There were no tracks going in. The tracks came from the door, and they walked 5 paces into the yard, and they stopped. Not turned. Not veered. Stopped. As if the dog had walked 5 paces into the yard and had, in the middle of a step, ceased to be somewhere that made tracks. He stood over the last print for a long time. It was the front left paw. He knew it the way he knew his own thumbprint. Prue had a spur on that paw that made the print asymmetric, and there it was, planted in the soft dirt of the yard, deep enough to have held her full weight, and beyond it, nothing. Not a scuff. Not a drag. Nothing. He walked back to the low door. He put his hand on the wood. He did not open it. He said out loud to no one, because Sabra was in the flatland and Prue was gone, and there was no one on the ridge to hear him. He said, low door. Latched low. That was the phrase that would come to him again and again in the next several days, and the phrase he would repeat without meaning to, at odd hours out loud under his breath, waking in the middle of the night with it already on his lips. Low door. Latched low. He would say it like a prayer. He would say it like a receipt. Low door. Latched low. It would become, in Ellery's telling, the shape of that year in his life. A rhythm his mind kept even after his mouth had forgotten it. Over the next 10 days, the anomaly ladder went the way anomaly ladders go on Cutter's Ridge. Each day was strictly worse than the day before. On the 11th day, the handkerchief was gone from the inside of the door. Not fallen. Not slipped. Gone. The pin was still in the wood. There was no cloth on it. The pin had not been bent or pulled. There was, on the pine board just under the pin, a very small mark. A smudge brown no larger than a thumbnail, that looked, when Verlin bent to it, like a print of a hand that had been laid there in dry mud. Not the palm, just the 4 fingertips. And they were placed as if the hand had reached from the inside of the wood, not from the outside. He took the pin out. He put it in the drawer with the kitchen thread. He put a chair against the low door. He sat in the chair. He sat in the chair all night. Nothing happened. Nothing he could see. Only, at some hour he could not later place, he heard the sound again. With settling. On the inside. Behind the door. As if the wood of the door was thicker than it should have been, and something inside the thickness was moving in it. On the 13th day, the smokehouse door, which was on the low side of the yard, was found at first light, open a hand's width. He had latched it at dusk. He knew he had latched it at dusk. His fingers still remembered the wood. On the 15th day, he found a length of Sabra's hair pinned to the outside of the low door. Not the handkerchief. Hair. A short, cut length, tied in a small knot, no longer than a man's palm. She had cut a length of her hair before she left for the flatland. A common thing, a small keepsake, tied with red thread and left in a drawer, and it had been in a drawer. He knew which drawer. He had put it there himself. It was now pinned to the outside of the low door. In the morning, under a sky the color of wet slate, he walked to Mahala Tackett's porch that afternoon. Mahala was past 70 that year, and she was the oldest living woman on Cutter's Ridge. She was silver-haired and reed-thin, with a black shawl and an unlit pipe. She had a way of listening that made you feel like the words were being weighed as they left your mouth. She listened to Verlin for a long time, and she looked at the length of hair he had brought her. Tied in its knot, wrapped in the red thread, laid on a folded piece of newsprint. and she did not touch it. She said, "Verlin, what did your grandfather tell you about the rule?" "That it was the rule," he said. "That's all he told you." "That's all he told me." She looked past him, off toward the ridge. She slid her thumb up and down the stem of the pipe. "My grandmother told me a little more than that," she said. "She told me the rule was older than the ridge was named. She told me it came up out of the ground with the people who first settled here, and the people who first settled here had it from the people they took the ridge from, and the people they took the ridge from had it from before there was a word for it in any language on this mountain. She told me it wasn't a rule for us. She told me it was a rule for what lived under the low side of the house." Verlin sat very still. Under the low side, where the house is closest to the slope, where the crawl space is deepest and the earth is coldest. She paused. She turned her face toward him. Her eyes were the color of old iron in water. "She told me the rule wasn't a promise. She told me it was a debt. Every family up here signed the debt when they built on the ridge, and every family up here keeps the debt by latching the low door before the sun goes. That's the whole of it, Verlin. That's all I know. My grandmother wouldn't tell me any more, and I never asked. I never wanted to ask." "Why?" Verlin said. "Because a debt that old," she said, "gets angry when you look at it directly. You know how a well gets angry when you look down into it too long, when the black at the bottom stops being water and starts being a face. A debt like this one is worse. A debt like this one wants your looking. It wants your naming. It wants your mouth to shape the word for it. And the day it gets any of those three things from you, that's the day the low door isn't a door anymore. That's the day it's a mouth. Do you understand me, Verlin? Don't look. Don't name. Don't say it out loud." She reached out then, and she put one thin hand on his wrist. Her hand was cold, and it was gentle, and it was the hand of an old woman who had known his mother, and his grandmother, and every generation of Ashmores that had held the south face of Cutter's Ridge. She said, "Verlin, somebody has been in your house, or something has, and it's counting." "Counting what?" he said. She looked at him for a long time, and what she said next, Ellery Souter told me 60 years later at her kitchen table, was the sentence that never left Verlin Ashmore for the rest of his life. "Counting the things you love," Mahala said, "one at a time, small first, the dog, the handkerchief, the hair, then bigger. You need to be out of that cabin, Verlin, before it reaches the last thing." He walked back to his cabin in the late afternoon. He walked slowly, because his bad left knee was cold. He walked past the walnut in his yard, where the jays should have been and were not. He walked past the smokehouse, whose door was closed, and closed properly, and latched. He walked past the low door of his cabin, and he did not stop at it. He walked around to the high door and he went in. He sat at the kitchen table, in the chair where Prue used to sit before her, and he made a plan. The plan was this. He would leave the cabin at dawn. He would take the wagon down to the flatland 3 days' drive, and he would fetch Sabra home. He would not sleep in the cabin again after that night. He would sleep the last night in the cabin because you did not travel Cutter's Ridge after dark, and because he was a careful man, and because the wagon had to be greased. He would leave at first light. He would ride out in the morning, and he would not be back on the ridge until Sabra was with him, and until Mahala had been to the cabin, and until Elderbar had been to the cabin, and until the ridge itself had decided what to do with the low door. That was the plan. He greased the wagon. He mended the traces. He packed a bag. He set a lamp beside the bed. He latched the low door. He opened the high door a hand's width. He said out loud to no one, "Low door. Latched low." And he lay down on the bed in his boots. He meant to leave in the morning. He did not get the morning. The sound came a little after midnight. Not with settling this time. Not from behind the door. This time it was the latch of the low door. A slow, careful sound, as if a hand that knew latches was working the latch. Not pulling, not forcing, working. The way a careful man works a latch. The way Verlin himself would have worked a latch, if Verlin had been on the other side. He got up. He did not light the lamp. He stood in his kitchen in the dark, in his boots, and he listened. The latch stopped. The wood breathed. And then, very softly, from behind the low door, from behind the wood, not from outside it, he heard a voice he knew. It was Sabra's voice. said his name. Just his name. Verlin. In her voice. In the way she had of saying it when she was tired at the end of a long day, when she wanted him to come to bed, when she had forgotten she was already annoyed with him and had softened again toward him. Verlin. Once. He did not move. He did not answer. He said, in his own head, in his own careful iron voice, Sabra is in the flatland. Sabra is 3 days from here. Sabra is at her sister's with the new baby, and she has no way of standing behind my low door at midnight, and the voice behind my low door is not my wife. But it was her voice. Her exact voice. Low door. Latched low. He backed away from the door. He backed all the way to the wall. And that is when he understood, with the sudden, cold, complete understanding of a careful man who has finally read the whole page, that the rule was not for keeping something out. The rule was for keeping something from finishing what it had started. The dog. The handkerchief. The hair. The voice. It was counting. Mahala had said so. Counting the things he loved. And it had gotten to the voice. And after the voice was the woman herself. And after the woman was him. He did not open the door. Now, everything I have told you so far, Verlin walking the ridge, the tracks in the yard, the length of hair pinned to the outside of the door, Ellery told me from memory. But this part, the part that comes now, Ellery told me from a book. Verlin Ashmore kept a small commonplace book in the drawer of the kitchen table, in the years after this, and Ellery had that book, and Ellery read to me from it. The pages were soft. The ink was brown. His hand was slow. What he wrote that night, in the moments after he understood, was this. He wrote it on a Tuesday. In ink he mixed himself. It was one line. It was low door, latched low. Did not open, did not open, did not open. 3 times. In case he forgot. In case he was tempted, later, by the voice of a woman he loved, to reach for a latch. He did not open the door. He waited by the wall. He did not sleep. The voice said his name twice more, at intervals so long apart that he almost believed the intervals themselves had a rhythm. Verlin. Then, an hour later. Verlin. Then, another hour. Verlin. And then it stopped, and the wood breathed, and the wood was quiet, and the wood was again wood. The first light came the color of milk on iron. He left the cabin by the high door. He did not look back at the low door. He walked around the outside of the cabin, past the smokehouse to the wagon, and he greased the last of the traces, and he hitched the mule, and he did not look at the low door of his own house even once. He knew if he looked he would look for the print of the 4 fingers on the wood. He knew if he saw the print he would go to it. He knew if he went to it he would put his own hand against it. He knew, in the way careful men know, that some doors you have to leave without seeing. He drove down to the flatland. Took 3 days. He did not tell Sabra any of what had happened. He said only, I have come to fetch you, and she said, Verlin, you look like you have not slept, and he said, I have not, and she asked no more, and they drove back up together over the next 3 days. That is a 6-day gap in this story, and I will not fill it, because in Ellery's telling those 6 days were the 6 days her uncle refused ever to describe. He would say only that he did not sleep on the way down, and he did not sleep on the way back, and that Sabra sat beside him on the wagon board with her small, thin hand on his forearm the entire time, and did not once ask him what had happened, because a woman married 26 years to a careful man knows when the story will come and when it will not. They came up the switchback in the last light of the 6th day. Verlin drove the wagon into the yard, and he handed the reins to Sabra, and he said, wait here. And she waited, and he walked to the low door of his own house, and he stood in front of it, and he did not touch it, and he said out loud, low door, latched low. And he walked around to the high door, and he opened it, and he lit a lamp, and he came back out, and he said, come in the high door and don't look at the low. She came in the high door. She did not look at the low. She did that not because she believed him, but because she trusted him, which is a heavier thing. They did not sleep in the cabin that night. They slept in the wagon, in the yard, under blankets, with the mule tied to the walnut tree, and Sabra's small hand on his forearm the way it had been on the wagon board for 6 days. In the morning, Verlin walked to Elderbar's cabin at first light, and to Mahalatakat's cabin at second light, and both of them came to the yard by mid-morning, and by noon there were 9 people standing in Verlin Ashmore's yard, the entire population of the ridge that year except a child too small to walk. They did not open the low door. What they did was this. Elderbar, mid-50s, wiry, white eyebrows, pale gray eyes, black coat. Read from his book at the low door for nearly 2 hours, and did not open the door once. Mahala Tackett, past 70, silver hair, black shawl, unlit pipe, stood beside him with one thin hand on the wood of the door, and did not open the door once. Cordell Meese, 54, and Asaph Cruz, past 60, and Jem Ballard, 28, took the wood from the smokehouse and built a second door. A heavy, iron-strap door, over the low door, and set it into the frame with new nails, and did not open the low door once. Susie Yancey, past 60, brought a small clay bowl of salt and set it on the ground in front of the double door. Iola Ballard, 26, hung a length of red thread across the top of the double door and knotted it in 3 places. And that was all any of them did that day. Nobody explained. Nobody named. Nobody said out loud what was behind the low door. They only doubled the door, and salted the ground, and knotted the thread, and went home before dark. That was the plan. The plan was not the plan for very long, because on the 6th night after the doubling of the door, a night that was supposed to be a quiet night, a night Verlin and Sabra were supposed to spend in the wagon in the yard while the smoke from the kitchen went up straight. A storm came up off the south face, earlier than anyone had said it would, and the wind came in hard, and the mule spooked, and the wagon slipped its brake, and the wagon went sideways down the switchback, and Verlin, being a careful man, ran after the mule in the dark an hour before the sun should have set, but 2 hours after the sun had actually gone behind the storm, and he came back into the yard in full dark, and he came back into the yard from the low side of the yard, and he came into the yard with the mule's rope in his hand and mud on his knees, and he did not, in the dark, in the storm, in the moment his hands were full of the mule and his mind was full of Sabra. He did not remember which door was the low door. He came to a door. He put his hand on the latch. Sabra called to him from the wagon, from up the slope. She called his name. He heard her call. He hesitated. He looked. He could not tell, in the dark, which side of the cabin he was on. And here is where the story turns on a hinge you cannot see. Because from inside the door his hand was on, another voice. A voice that was also his wife's. Called his name, softly, from very close to the wood. He heard both. At the same time. Sabra above, in the wagon, in the wind. Sabra below, in the wood, in the wet. He did not open the door. He let go of the latch. He stepped back. He fell because his bad left knee gave, and he went down on the mud on his back, and he lay there with the rain in his face and the mule breathing beside him. And Sabra came down the slope in the storm, and she took his hand, and she pulled him up, and she led him around the outside of the cabin, and they went in the high door. They went in the high door. That is the thing. In the storm, in the dark, with 2 of her voices calling him at once. He did not open the low door. But he could not, after that, say for the rest of his life whether the door his hand had been on was the low door or the high door. That is the thing Ellery said broke him. Not the sound. Not the voice. Not the counting. That one moment. That one uncertainty. He could not know. He could not know, standing there in the mud in the storm with his knee going out, whether he had been about to open a door that would have let something in. He never afterward knew. He knew only that Sabra came down the slope and pulled him up before he found out. They left the cabin the next morning. They did not come back to it. They moved down to the flatland, to Sabra's sister's place, and Verlin took work in a small mill outside a town called Ballard's Landing. And he wrote once a season to Mahala Tackett until the day Mahala died, past 90, in the winter of 1929. He never lived on Cutter's Ridge again. But, and this is the part one want you to hear, he was not, after that night, a whole man. Ellery said her uncle carried a small mark on his throat, no bigger than a coin, that had not been on his throat before that night in the mud. Nobody ever explained the mark, and Verlin never spoke of it, and Ellery only knew it was there because her Aunt Sabra bathed him in the last long illness of his life, and Sabra told Ellery, in the year Sabra died, that the mark had come up on his throat the morning after the storm, and it had never faded, and it looked, if you looked at it in a certain light, like the print of 4 fingers, laid there in dry mud. He lived is the thing. He lived. He kept the marriage. He kept Sabra. He kept the commonplace book. But something of him stayed on Cutter's Ridge. Some small count of him. Some final tally at the low door. Ellery said the man who came down off the ridge was not the man who had gone up it. He was quieter than he had been. He laughed less. He counted more. He counted his tools each night before he put them away. He counted the eggs in the basket twice before he sold them. He counted the steps between the mill door and the water pump every morning and every evening for 26 years, and when Sabra asked him once, gently, why he counted, he only said, "I don't want anything else to be counting for me." That was the whole of the answer he ever gave her. That was the whole of the answer he ever gave anyone. And here is where the story goes into the outside world, the ordinary bureaucratic world, the world of records and offices and letters. Because Sabra, being a practical woman, wrote to the county land office in the spring of 1911 to ask about the deed to the Ashmore cabin. She wanted to know whether the cabin could be sold, or whether the land under it could be leased for pasture, and she wrote 3 letters, and she went once, in person, to the county seat, and she sat across a desk from a clerk whose name Ellery could not remember, and the clerk searched the deed book for the entire south face of Cutter's Ridge. And, this is the sentence, the clerk found no record of an Ashmore cabin.
No parcel.
No lot.
No deed.
The land the cabin stood on was recorded, in the deed book, as unimproved, wooded, uninhabited. There had never been a structure on it, according to the county. The clerk was very sorry for the confusion. The clerk assumed a filing error. The clerk suggested Sabra file a new claim. Sabra did not file a new claim. Sabra thanked the clerk, and she went out onto the courthouse steps. And she stood there in the sun for a long time, and she went home. She wrote once more, in the autumn of that year, and the second clerk who answered her, a younger man, thorough, with clean hands, sent back a letter that said the same thing in longer words. Unimproved. Wooded. Uninhabited. No structure on record. The county was sorry. The county could not help her. That was 1911. The cabin was still on the ridge. The double door was still on the low side. The salt was still on the ground. The red thread was still knotted 3 times. The county had no record. The cabin was there and it was not there. That is how the story ends for the outside world. It ends with a clerk in a courthouse, in the sun, being very sorry for a confusion. Ellery said her Aunt Sabra kept a small ritual every night of her life after that, no matter what house she was living in. Ellery said her Aunt Sabra would go to whichever door of whichever house was the lower door, the one nearest the downslope of whatever land they were on, and she would put her small, thin hand flat on the wood, and she would say, under her breath, "Low door, latched low," and she would check the latch a second time and she would go to bed. She did this every night for the rest of her life. She did it in the house at Ballard's Landing. She did it in the small house they moved to in her late years, on the flat road outside Asheville, where there was no ridge at all and no low side of anything and no reason on earth to keep the rule. She did it anyway. She did it because Verlin did it. And Verlin did it because on a night in the storm in 1908, he had not been able to know, in the dark, which door his hand was on. Ellery said her aunt would say the 4 words softly, like a woman putting a small stone in a pocket, and then she would kiss the wood once, in the middle, and only then would she come to bed. Ellery said the wood at the middle of that last low door, in the small house on the flat road outside Asheville, had a paler patch worn into it by the end of Sabra's life, no larger than the print of a mouth, and Ellery said, when she was going through the house after her aunt died, she stood in front of that pale patch for a long time, and she did not touch it. He died in the winter of 1934. He was 70. Sabra bathed him in the last week, and she saw the mark on his throat one last time, and she covered it before the neighbors came. She lived until 1951. She was buried beside him in a small churchyard outside Ballard's Landing, and the stones are still there, and if you go and stand in front of them at dusk on a day with any weather at all, you will find, I am told, by the woman who tends the stones for the county, that the last light of the day lays itself along the low side of Sabra Ashmore's stone, and never along the high side, and the woman who tends the stones does not know why. That is her word for it. She said, I don't know why. It just does. Every dusk, every weather, the low side, and Cutter's Ridge is still there. The cabin is not. It burned in the summer of 1938, in a fire nobody in the hollow could account for on a day when no lightning was reported anywhere in the county. The double door burned. The salt scattered. The red thread went to ash. The land, according to the county, was still unimproved. It still is. If you drive up the switchback today, past the mailboxes on their leaning posts, past the pale blue kitchen curtains people still hang for luck, You will find that every cabin on Cutter's Ridge still latches the low door before the sun goes down, and still leaves the high door open a hand's width until the last color leaves the ridge. Ask them. They will not tell you why. They'll say it's how their people did it. They'll say it's just the way. And they'll close the conversation softly, and they'll wait for you to leave. There are children on that ridge today, born in this century, who could not tell you what a double door is, who have never heard the name Ashmore, who have never seen the pale patch on the low door of a gray tant's kitchen. And every one of those children, every night of their lives, latches the low door of their own house first, and does not know they are doing it and could not tell you why. I want to leave you with one small question tonight. Not a hard one. Just a small one. Was there a rule in the house you grew up in? A rule nobody ever explained to you? A rule your mother obeyed, and her mother before her? A rule you still obey without knowing why? A door you close first? A window you leave open? A chair nobody sits in? A word you don't say after dark? If there was, tell me about it in the comments. I mean it. Every one of these stories I tell you comes from somebody who wrote a comment like the one I am asking you to write tonight. It might just become the next story I tell. And if a rule from your own family becomes the next one, I will tell you it is yours, and I will read your name on this same voice on this same channel before the story begins. I have another one waiting for you, though, if you want to know where I'm going next. Some ways east of Cutter's Ridge, on the border where North Carolina slopes down toward Tennessee, there is an old chapel on a place called Widow's Bend, and every Sunday morning of every summer between 1889 and 1907, an empty pew in the second row was found still warm to the touch when the congregation came in for the first service, and nobody in the county could ever say who had been sitting in it. That is the next one. I'll bring it to you as soon as I have it whole. Until then, mind the low corner. Mind it every night, and go easy on the doors of houses you don't yet know.